Welcome to the channel. Have you heard that Eastern and other masks are not harmless? In the old house, lost on the outskirts of the city, there was a silence as if life itself had abandoned these walls. The windows were boarded up from the inside, the cracks in the frames patched with brittle tape, and the doors were secured with a lock that no one had opened for some time. Neighbors had grown accustomed to passing by, careful not to linger their gaze. In the evenings, when the wind drove dust along the empty street, the house seemed alive. It groaned, creaked, and almost sighed. The house was giving signs. But no one dared to come closer. When they finally entered, not of their own will, but out of necessity, they were met with the musty smell of rot mixed with candle wax. The entire floor was covered with white grains of salt, arranged in lines and circles that stretched from room to room. Crosses were nailed to the walls, hammered so roughly it seemed they had been fixed in haste. Between them, pages torn from books jutted out, written in someone else's hand, like instructions for protection against something invisible. In the bathroom, where the smell of dampness and rust was strongest, they discovered the body of a man. He sat in the empty bathtub, hunched, hands folded across his chest. His head rested against the wall, as if he had simply fallen asleep, but his facial expression revealed not slumber, but an instant, piercing terror. His eyes were open, frozen in emptiness. Next to him lay a thick diary. Its pages were covered in dense, nervous handwriting. The beginning was still restrained, observations, descriptions of strange sounds, minor complaints about insomnia. But the closer one reached to the end, the more unhinged the entries became. The letters trembled, words broke into fragments, and lines sometimes devolved into scribbles, as if the author were writing in a hurry or in the dark. The last entry, dated the previous evening, no longer contained reports or attempts to explain what was happening. Only a few short lines, etched into the paper so deeply that the pencil broke, leaving furrows. They are here. Tonight they will take me. I can no longer resist. Forgive me. Beneath the words ran a long smear of candle wax, as if a hand had trembled at the last moment. As the pages were turned, it became clear, the person who had written these words was utterly convinced that death was coming for him. With each entry, he drifted further from the familiar world. It seemed he was not so much keeping a diary as confessing to the void, knowing that one day these lines would be found, and they would become the only explanation for what had happened to him. The items left in the apartment shed no light on his past. A few books on ancient history, a collection of strange objects made of bronze and stone, photographs without captions, all that remained indicated that he lived alone and trusted few. But anyone who read his diary felt a coldness in their chest and an involuntary urge to glance over their shoulder, as if the fear written on the pages were contagious, as if the horror the man had tried to contain with salt, crosses, and sleepless nights had seeped into the room through the letters and scribbles themselves. His diary ended there. But the story was only beginning. His name was Thomas Gray. At least, that's how it was recorded in the documents. But those who knew him could say very little. He rarely spoke of himself, and even more rarely allowed anyone to delve into the details of his life. For the neighbors, he was that man from the old house, silent, focused, always alone. His days passed in the same way, early walks along empty streets, rare trips to the library, and even rarer visits to antique shops. There, he would study ancient books and strange objects for a long time, sometimes buying something. He was particularly interested in anything related to Mediterranean and Middle Eastern cults. No one understood where this fascination came from. Inside the house, his life appeared even more secluded. The rooms were filled with shelves, where alongside familiar volumes on music and history stood dusty folios in Latin and Greek. Among the books lay artifacts, bronze figurines, ceramic fragments, pieces of darkened cloth that seemed to hold the scent of antiquity. On the walls hung maps of old excavations and drawings of symbols, the origins of which were known only to a few specialists. Rumors circulated about his past. Some believed he had worked as an archaeologist. Others thought he was a lone scholar, disillusioned with the academic world. Thomas himself neither confirmed nor denied anything. To the people, he remained a mystery. But one thing was certain, he lived as if he had consciously erased himself from society. He had no family, no close relationships, and avoided conversations. Even in the store, he answered briefly, only as much as necessary. It seemed his existence revolved solely around books, silence, and some hidden studies. In the rare moments when he could be seen in the library, Thomas sat aside, always with a thick notebook. He made notes, not words, but symbols, diagrams, schematics, sometimes so complex that librarians involuntarily lingered on them. But the moment he noticed their attention, he would immediately close the pages. Over time, he became almost invisible to those around him. People grew used to his presence, yet it was as if he were not there. Even his name dissolved into the everyday routine of the small town. However, a careful observer would notice something else: Thomas lived in constant vigilance. His gaze always lingered on empty corners, on mirrors, on the dark window panes. He often changed his walking routes, as if checking whether he was being followed. In the evenings, he went out into the yard, standing for a long time, staring at the sky, as if searching for something. But he did not seem insane, rather, a man who knew too much. As if the past he kept silent about was connected to something best left untold. And it was precisely this past, carefully hidden from prying eyes, that became the key to what happened to him in his final days. For Thomas Gray was a man without a past only to outsiders. To himself, he was the bearer of a secret that was never meant to be discovered. The house in which Thomas lived always felt foreign, even to himself. He had bought it on the outskirts of the city for a laughably low price, an old building with crumbling plaster, an overgrown garden, and a basement that smelled of dampness and iron. Most people would have avoided such a dwelling, but Thomas was drawn to the silence and seclusion. He needed a house where he could hide from the world, and this one seemed like the perfect refuge. The first years were calm. Neighbors rarely saw him, and he made no effort to socialize. The house lived its usual, slightly decrepit life. The floorboards creaked, pipes clanged at night, and the walls cracked with temperature changes. Thomas knew these sounds and paid them no mind. But one day, in mid-autumn, he began to notice something different among the ordinary noises. It sounded like a whisper, quiet and drawn out, as if someone were standing behind the walls speaking so close that the words were almost decipherable, yet always slipped away. At first, Thomas told himself it was only a trick of the imagination. Perhaps the wind seeped through the cracks, and his mind filled in the rest. However, the whisper repeated every night. Always after midnight. At first, it was barely audible, like breath. Then it grew more insistent, as if the voices were trying to capture his attention. Sometimes they sounded to the right of the bed, sometimes as if from beneath the floor, and once Thomas was certain he heard them right next to his ear. Sleep became impossible. He would jump up, switch on the lights, and inspect the house. But he found no one. There were no cracks in the walls through which sound could pass, and the windows and doors remained locked. Then small objects began to move on their own. A book left on the table would end up on the floor. A candle, extinguished the night before, was slightly melted again, as if it had been lit in his absence. In the wardrobe, he found drawers open several times, though he remembered closing them. Over time, the whisper turned into something more. Thomas began to discern a rhythm in it, as if it were a language. Sometimes it seemed he could hear a repeated word or a name. He tried to write down the sounds, but only crackling and emptiness appeared on the pages. One night, while sitting in the library among his books, a bronze figurine on the shelf directly in front of him slowly shifted. It did not fall or roll, it moved on its own, leaving a faint trace of dust. Thomas stared at it, paralyzed, and for the first time in a long while, he felt genuine fear. He tried to explain it all as fatigue, nerves, or self-suggestion. But the traces became increasingly obvious. In the morning, he noticed a scratch on his hand, as if left by a nail. Thomas understood, this was no mere noise of an old house, and it was not a trick of the mind. Something had taken up residence in his refuge that he could neither see nor explain. The whisper was only the beginning. From that moment on, silence ceased to be an ally. Each night now carried with it the expectation of a presence that was not his own. Long before Thomas settled into his gloomy house, his life had been very different. Even in his youth, he traveled frequently. None of those who knew him later could have imagined that he was once a lively and passionate man, drawn to discoveries. Everything changed after a trip he never spoke of. Only in his old notes, hidden among his books, could hints of this journey be found. One day, during excavations in northern Syria, near ancient ruins, Thomas came across an object that no one else noticed. It was a bronze mask, partially hidden under a layer of stones and soil. The metal was darkened, in places covered with green patina, but the eyes of the mask glowed with a strange, cold light. It did not look like a work of art, but like a ritual tool. The face was distorted, the mouth slightly open, as if in a silent scream, and above the eyebrows were carved symbols, resembling scars. Thomas could not determine its age at the time. The mask did not belong to any known cultures, yet its contours felt far older than Greek or Assyrian artifacts. He took it secretly. His colleagues were busy with other finds, and Thomas decided to keep the mask for himself. From that day on, he carried it as a personal trophy, though deep down he sensed it was a mistake. At first, the strange occurrences seemed coincidental. Soon after his return home, one expedition member died, sudden cardiac arrest in his sleep. Another fell into a prolonged depression and vanished without a trace. The third's house burned down. Thomas attributed everything to chance, though deep inside, he felt the cause was something else. The mask remained in his house, first on a shelf, then in a separate box, later, under lock and key. But no matter where he hid it, he knew, it was always near. Sometimes he would catch himself standing before it, staring into the empty eye sockets, losing all sense of time. Sometimes he woke at night with the feeling of being watched, and his gaze inevitably turned to the place where the artifact was stored. Remarkably, over the years, the mask seemed to grow heavier. He noticed its surface changing, the lines of the symbols deepened, as if the metal were healing. At times, it seemed to him that the mouth of the mask opened wider. Then Thomas began studying cults he had only skimmed over before. He searched for mentions of bronze masks, sacrificial rituals, and ancient societies that had vanished without a trace. And the deeper he delved, the clearer it became: he had brought into his home not merely a relic. In one old manuscript, he found a description of a ritual to banish the masters of shadows, in which bronze masks were said to capture the faces of those offered as sacrifices. The masks became vessels for undying voices. They were not meant to leave the ground where they were buried. Thomas closed the book, and in that moment, for the first time, he felt that his life no longer belonged to him. From that day, the whispering began to grow. Now he knew what had brought it into his house. The mask was not just a find. It was a door. When Thomas realized that the mask was the source of the sinister whispering, he tried to get rid of it. First, he took it to the basement, wrapping it in cloth and burying it in salt. A few days passed, and the house was silent. But on the fourth night, he heard metal scraping in the basement. As if the mask were moving, trying to get out. This is recorded in his diary. Then he buried it in the garden, deep under an old tree. But by morning, the earth had been disturbed, as if turned inside out. The mask lay on the surface, glinting with a green patina on the bronze. Thomas picked it up with trembling hands and realized, it could not be disposed of. From that moment began his terrible 7 nights, each one growing more terrifying than the last. The audible whispering turned into footsteps. Thomas heard someone walking through the corridors, lingering at his door, scratching the wood with nails. When he rose from his bed, there was no one in the hallway. Yet on the floor remained faint traces, barely visible bare footprints leading into the darkness. On the second night, sleep no longer came. Thomas sat in the library, surrounded by candles. The mask lay on the table, and the flames reflected in its eye sockets. Suddenly, the fire flickered, as if blown by wind, and all the candles went out at once. In the darkness, he heard numerous voices speaking his name. On the third night, the mirrors of the house began to show something else. In the reflections, Thomas did not see himself, but the room behind, where shadows stood in the corners. They did not move, yet with each passing minute, they grew denser, as if preparing to step out. He smashed all the mirrors, but he knew, the reflections had not disappeared, they no longer needed glass. Exhausted, he slept a little by dawn. On the fourth night, Thomas felt touches. Invisible hands touched him in his sleep, tugging at his hair, even leaving scratches on his skin. Upon waking, he saw that the blood on the sheets was still fresh. Thomas began wearing a cross on his chest and sleeping inside a circle of salt. But even this did not help, the touches grew bolder. On the fifth night, the house seemed to come alive. The walls breathed, the floorboards bowed, as if someone moved beneath them. The windows cracked, though the wind was calm. In the corridors, crying could be heard, like that of a child. Thomas stood at the door, and beyond it, someone slowly echoed his footsteps. By the evening of the 6th day, the mask had changed. Now its mouth was fully open, like in a silent scream. The symbols on the bronze seemed to glow from within, shimmering with a dull light. Thomas noticed that it had begun to watch him. Wherever he placed it, its gaze was always fixed on him. He feared the evenings and the nights. He sensed something wrong approaching. Thomas feared the coming 7th night. He knew in advance that he was living his final hours. He recorded everything in his diary, the rhythm of the steps, the whispering of many voices, strange words that sounded like spells. The lines of salt on the floor no longer held boundaries, they were broken, as if swept away by invisible hands. That night, he did not lie down to sleep. The candles burned, the pages of his diary filled with scrawls. He wrote as his hands trembled, as his mind clouded. And behind him, ever closer and closer, came that same whisper. He knew, the 7 nights were not a warning. They were a countdown. After Thomas's death, the house remained empty for a long time. Neighbors tried to avoid it, windows boarded up, a gloomy silhouette against the sky, and rumors spreading faster than weeds in the garden. It seemed as if the very air around it had absorbed what had happened inside. But one day, someone came. A young archivist named Edward, assigned to sort through the deceased's papers. He was told that Thomas had once been a scholar, and perhaps among his records there were valuable materials. Edward was skeptical, old books, dusty notes, nothing unusual. Yes, there couldn't be anything important, valuable. But he agreed, if only for the payment. When he entered the house, he was met with a heavy, oppressive silence. The air was thick, like in a sealed crypt. Salt lay everywhere, in circles and lines, now scattered and compacted. On the walls remained traces of nails, where crosses had hung. An unusual sight. But what drew the most attention was the diary. A thick notebook, lying on the table, with charred edges and pages covered in uneven handwriting. Edward opened it without much interest. The first entries seemed like ordinary notes of a lonely man. But the further he read, the more he felt the presence of something foreign. The lines grew increasingly chaotic, and each paragraph seemed to infect his thoughts, planting alien images in his mind. Edward involuntarily lifted his eyes and looked at the table. The mask lay there, in the center of the room. He was certain he hadn't seen it before. The metal glinted dimly in the dusty window light, the mouth was open, and the eyes seemed like voids. A chill ran through his skin. He pushed the diary aside and closed the lid of the box where the artifact had been. But it was too late. The words he had read were already lodged in his mind. He left the house in the evening, as the sun sank behind the rooftops. In his hands was Thomas's diary. Edward decided to continue reading at home, at first out of curiosity, then out of growing unease. He felt that the entries contained a key. But that night, he awoke for the first time, sensing, or imagining, someone standing at the foot of his bed. From that moment, he was no longer just an archivist. He became the last witness to a story that did not belong to Thomas alone. Thomas's diary lay on the table like a foreign organ, ripped from a body and still pulsing. Edward told himself it was just paper and ink, that no words could cause harm. Yet each time he opened it, he felt a strange shiver, as if cold radiated from the depths of the pages. He began reading the diary at night. During the day, he lacked the courage. The entries grew increasingly insane. Thomas described how the mask breathed, how whispers merged into a single voice, how the walls of his house watched. At first, Edward chuckled, obvious paranoia. But soon, when he looked away from reading, he began to hear a faint rustling, as if the pages moved on their own, even when he didn't touch them. After a few days, he noticed something strange, the text was changing. Where the previous day there had been uneven lines of fear, new words now emerged. They were written in the same handwriting, but seemingly for him. You read me. Now I read you. Edward slammed the diary shut, but curiosity would not let go. Every morning he promised himself he would never open it again, and every night he found his hands back on its cover. The dreams began to repeat. He saw the mask, hovering in the air above his bed. From its empty eye sockets, smoke flowed, and the smoke formed the silhouettes of people. They stood silently beside him, translucent, yet with terrifyingly recognizable faces. Among them was Thomas. His eyes were burned with darkness, but his lips moved without sound. Edward awoke, gasping, and heard a quiet whisper in the room, as if the words from the diary continued to speak on their own. On the seventh night, he could no longer bear it. He tore a page where it was written, "My word will become your breath." But the paper would not tear. The sheet was stronger than metal. Then he threw the diary into the fire. Flames engulfed the pages, but soon it became clear, they would not burn. The ink merely glowed red, like blood under fire, and the letters moved, intertwining into new lines. He snatched the book from the flames and, trembling, dropped it to the floor. There, on the scorched page, new words emerged. "You tried to rid yourself of me. Now we are bound." Edward realized that the mask was no longer in Thomas's house. It was here. With him. And the words he had read had already begun to live inside him. From the moment the diary fell into Edward's hands, the mask ceased to be a mere object. It began to act directly, choosing him as its new victim. The first sign was barely noticeable. Edward found the bronze mask lying on the carpet in the hallway, though he was certain he had left it on the table. The metal was warm, as if radiating living heat, and the empty eye sockets glowed with a dull green light. He felt a chill seep inside, as though the bronze were trying to penetrate through his skin. With each night, the presence of the mask grew stronger. Shadows appeared in the room that could not be explained by ordinary light or angles. They slid along the walls, left traces on the floor, and sometimes reflected in the glass. Edward saw them, even when he turned on the light. Edward's dreams became unbearable. He saw the mask flying over the city, its tendrils of shadow reaching for random passers-by. He heard Thomas's whisper, and thousands of other voices, shifting, intertwining into one, a threat, a promise, a challenge. Every morning, Edward found new marks on his body, scratches, bruises, sometimes tiny burns, as if fire had touched his skin. He tried to leave the mask in a locked room, but it always ended up nearby, on the windowsill, on a chair, on his bed. The mask seemed to have consciousness. It chose moments when he was vulnerable, at night, in darkness, when he fell asleep. And each time he approached it, the sensation of cold and pressure intensified to nearly physical pain. 7 nights Thomas had built a defense, salt, crosses, incantations. For Edward, there was only observation, and the absorption of the fear that saturated every line of the diary. He understood that the mask did not merely watch. It teaches, it conquers, it waits to seize full control of his mind. And one night, Edward felt the bronze touch his face. It was not lying nearby, it had stuck to his skin, cold and motionless, like a bronze mirror with empty eye sockets. His reflection in the mirror began to change, his facial features warped, his skin paled, his eyes seemed hollow. The mask seemed to attempt to extract his essence and absorb it. He knew that if the mask fully claimed him, his personality would vanish, like Thomas's. And the diary, soaked in fear and whispers, would become a new conduit for the next victim. At that moment, He understood the truth: the mask did not merely choose, it created a bond, irreversible and deadly. Edward no longer slept. His days and nights had merged into an unbroken nightmare. The mask did not leave him for a step, it stood on the table, lay on the bed, vanished and appeared in the most unexpected places. He felt its weight not only physically, but mentally. Every breath grew heavy, his thoughts tangled, memory fractured. Thomas's diary lay nearby, open to a page of scribbles that seemed written specifically for him. Each letter trembled, as if alive. Edward realized that resistance was impossible. Any action, any attempt to close the diary or discard the mask only strengthened its influence. That night, the shadows gathered completely. They filled his room, occupying space to the brim, like water slowly filling a vessel. The whispers merged into a single resonant voice, repeating the same words: "You have found me. Now I am yours. You cannot escape. You are next." The mask leapt from the bed onto his face by itself. He tried to push it away with his hands, but it was heavy, immovable, like an iron rock. Its cold penetrated through his skin, into his bones, into his blood, into his very soul. In that moment, Edward felt his consciousness fracture. Thomas's thoughts, the whispers of 1,000 voices, and his own fear, all blended into a single current from which there was no escape. He saw his reflection in the mirror dissolve, replaced by a foreign face, a face distorted by bronze, eyes empty, mouth open in a silent scream. Edward realized that he was now becoming part of the mask. Thomas's essence, his fears, the diary, and Edward's own mind, all fused into the bronze shell, waiting for the next person daring enough to look into the pages of the curse. That night, Edward's house fell into silence once again. Neighbors, if they had looked, would have noticed only one detail: the windows trembled slightly from a cold wind that seemed to come not from outside, but from within the walls. Edward disappeared. The diary remained on the table, open to a new page, on which the ink slowly spread, forming new lines: "Who is next?" And the mask, bronze and hollow-eyed, stood nearby, ready to choose the next witness who would be unable to escape its grip. The curse had not ended. It had only changed its bearer, leaving behind a chain of fear, ready to spread further, as long as someone dared to open the diary. Thomas's house on the outskirts of the city was empty once again. No one came near. Neighbors avoided it, but the rumors had already grown into legends. They said that inside one could hear footsteps, whispers, and a faint chime of bronze. No one dared to look inside, and the old building gradually became abandoned, as if waiting for the next person daring enough to enter. Thomas Gray's diary, now with Edward's added entries, lay on the table. The pages trembled, the ink slowly spreading, and the words shifted, forming new lines. Each sentence seemed to live its own life, directing the gaze toward the mask, the bronze artifact that waited. The mask stood motionless, yet its eye sockets glowed with a dull green light. It was not merely an object, it was an entity, a conduit, a trap for those who were too curious, too brave, or too lonely. Anyone who approached the diary or looked into its eyes would be drawn into a chain that could not be broken. And somewhere far away, outside the city, someone would stumble upon the old box containing the diary. Their fingers would tremble as they opened the first page. The reading would begin with curiosity and end in fear that would become reality. The mask would choose a new victim, and the words would come alive again, intertwining souls in an endless chain of terror. Thus, the curse would continue. Old houses, dusty libraries, dark corners, all would become places where fear awakens, and the mask watches, waits, and chooses. The story of Thomas and Edward ended for them. But the chain remained. And it would never break. The curse lives, whispers echo, and the mask, hollow-eyed and motionless, waits for the next. The mask, taken from the excavation.